Monk's Mound contains approximately 22 million cubic feet of earth. That number is easy to pass over, but hold it for a moment. By volume, by the sheer mass of material moved by human hands, Cahokia's central pyramid exceeds the Great Pyramid of Giza. Not by a little, by design. And yet most people encountering this fact for the first time have never heard the name of the city that built it. A city that stood at its height on the banks of the Mississippi River in what is now southern Illinois, larger by population than London, in the year 1050. The detail is quiet, and it refuses to go away. Tonight, we will follow 4 traces through the life and disappearance of Cahokia. The sudden emergence, a city that materialized in what appeared to have been mere decades, drawing people from across half a continent to a floodplain. No one had ever organized at this scale before, the astronomy written into circles of cedar wood. A single burial mound and what its layers of shell and bone preserve about how power was organized here, and what that power required. And finally, the question of the forgetting, deliberate, convenient, and still unfinished. We will not resolve any of this tonight. That is not what this space is for. We will trace what the record preserves and what it withholds, and let the questions remain where they have always rested, open. Patient and quietly insistent. The American bottom. The name archaeologists give to the floodplain stretching along the eastern bank of the Mississippi just south of where it meets the Missouri was not an obvious place for a city. It flooded unpredictably. The river moved when it chose to move, depositing silt one season and erasing field boundaries the next. For thousands of years, small woodland period communities had made it work. Villages of a few dozen people reading the water, planting native seed crops, raising modest earthen platforms for ceremony and burial. The land was generous. The way of life was stole. It could have continued indefinitely. Then around 1050 CE something changed. And here the record becomes both clear and strange. The archaeology does not describe a gradual rise. It describes something closer to ignition. Within what appears to have been 2 or 3 decades, a span shorter than a single long human life, the population of the American bottom multiplied many times over. Ceramic styles preserved in the ruins point to people arriving from the Great Lakes, from the southeastern coast, from the plains to the west. This was not a village that grew. It was a city that assembled cosmopolitan, almost suddenly drawing people who had never before lived in such proximity to strangers. The Grand Plaza alone required moving roughly 900,000 cubic feet of earth, not to raise a monument but to create a flat emptiness. 40 acres of deliberately levelled ground filled where the floodplain dipped and smoothed to run unbroken from the base of Monk's Mound to the ring of platform mounds encircling the perimeter. Someone held a vision of what that space should be, and held it long enough to organise years of labour toward it. What the record cannot tell us, not yet, and perhaps not ever, is what ignited all of this within what appears to have been a single generation. Some researchers point to a moment written in the sky. On the 4th of July, 1054 CE, Chinese astronomers recorded a new star appearing in the heavens. A supernova bright enough to be visible in daylight for weeks, remaining in the night sky for nearly 2 years. Rock art from other North American cultures may preserve its image. Whether this event was visible over the Mississippi floodplain, whether it was interpreted as a sign by communities already beginning to gather, whether it shaped or merely accompanied what was building here, these are questions the evidence holds open without resolving, not proof, a suggestion that arrives at the edge of the record and waits. What we know with more certainty is that the construction did not stop. Platform mounds were raised and modified across at least 14 distinct phases. A timber palisade enclosing the central precinct was built, dismantled and rebuilt at least 4 times each iteration, requiring tens of thousands of logs, hauled, set and eventually replaced. Woodhenge, the great circle of cedar posts west of Monk's Mound, was redesigned and expanded across at least 5 separate versions, each one refining the alignment between the uprights and the sun's passage through solstice and equinox. This is not a city that was built and then inhabited. It's a city that was continuously remade, adjusted, reconsidered, corrected across 2 centuries of sustained attention, and then gradually it was left. By the early 1400s, the core of Cahokia was largely empty. The mounds remained. The plaza held its geometry. The dark soil where Woodhenge's posts had stood still, carried the shape of the circles visible to anyone who knew to look. The population that had organised all of this dispersed some to upland communities nearby, some following the river roads outward, some becoming the ancestors of nations that would carry in their own oral traditions memories of a great city beside a great river. A world organised at a scale not seen before and not quite repeated after. The city did not vanish. The memory of it was permitted to fade. And in the centuries that followed, that fading was assisted through a story told with confidence and considerable convenience that these mounds could not possibly have been built by the people whose descendants were still living in their shadow. We will come to that layer of the record. It belongs in any honest account of what Cahokia was and what happened to it. But first, the question of why, in the span of what appears to have been a single human generation, tens of thousands of people gathered at this particular bend of river. What they built there in earth and wood and patient celestial alignment, and what it cost to hold all of it together. We follow the first trace now. The ground before the city. In the winter of 1050 CE, the American bottom was cold and flat and mostly quiet. The Mississippi moved in the dark beyond the tree line, carrying silt south toward the Gulf of Mexico, indifferent to the small fires burning in the settlements scattered across the floodplain. None of those settlements held more than a few hundred people. The earthen platforms some of them had raised were modest waist-high, their slopes softened by weather, and the long intervals between ceremonies maintained, but not enlarged, their purpose local and familiar to mark the dead, to elevate a council house, to place something sacred at a slight remove from ordinary ground. No one, as far as we can reconstruct, was planning anything larger. The landscape was generous, the way of life stable, and the distance between what was possible and what was being attempted had never across the preceding centuries been tested very hard. This is what archaeologists call the late woodland precursor to Cahokia, and what makes it strange is not its modesty. Small communities had thrived in the American bottom for generations, embedded in trade networks and ceremonial traditions that stretched across much of eastern North America, but the speed with which everything about it changed. Within what the record suggests was 2 or 3 decades, perhaps less, the scattered villages of the flooded plain were drawn into something that had no precedent anywhere north of the great Mesoamerican centers to the south. The transition is not gradual in the way that most transformations in the archaeological record appear gradual. It is compressed, almost violent in its compression, the stratigraphy closing the distance between one world and the next in a span that a single person might have lived through from youth to old age. To understand what followed, it helps first to understand what the American bottom offered, that made it of all of the landscapes available on the continent the one where this particular experiment took hold. The floodplain sits at a geographic convergence that is in purely practical terms without equal in the eastern half of North America. The Mississippi arrives from the north. The Missouri enters from the west, carrying the drainage of half a continent. The Illinois River feeds in from the northeast. Smaller tributaries descend from the surrounding uplands in every direction, and the result is a hub of waterways that, for a culture moving goods and people by canoe, functioned as both crossroads and anchor, a place you passed through because you had to or chose to remain near, because remaining meant access to almost everything that mattered. Stone Copper Shell Information Alliance. All of it flowed through here or could be made to flow through here by anyone with sufficient reason to redirect it. The soil beneath the floodplain is deep and black and layered, deposited over millennia, by seasonal inundation, holding moisture through dry stretches and draining quickly enough after floods that fields could be worked within days of the water receding. By the time maize varieties adapted to the shorter growing seasons of the upper Mississippi Valley had spread north from their origins far to the south, this particular soil could support them at yields that were difficult to achieve on the thinner, higher ground of the surrounding uplands. Maize does not perform equally everywhere. It requires specific combinations of moisture, temperature, and soil depth that the American bottom provided with a consistency that was by the agricultural standards of the 11th century close to exceptional. A surplus large enough to support people who did not themselves, farm specialists, labourers, priests, administrators, became possible here, in a way it was not reliably anywhere else in the region. The ecology surrounding the agricultural core was equally layered. Bottomland forests of oak and hickory gave way at their edges to wetlands dense with water foul during migration seasons. Prairie grasslands stretched across the slightly elevated terraces to the east, where deer moved in numbers large enough to support systematic hunting, across generations without collapse. Backwater lakes formed wherever the river had shifted course over the centuries held slow warm water productive of catfish and freshwater mussels. A community living in the American bottom in the year 1000 CE could hunt large game fish, harvest migratory birds, gather wild plant foods, and cultivate crops within a day's walk of the same hearth. This was not marginal subsistence. It was a landscape calibrated across thousands of years of accumulated knowledge to sustain people who had learned how to read it, and to sustain, if the organization were right, far more of them than had ever attempted to live here at once. What changed after 1050 was not the landscape. The American bottom remained what it had always been. What changed was the scale at which human organization attempted to use it, and the velocity at which that change arrived. Ceramic analysis from the earliest Cahokia layers shows something rarely encountered in this region: abrupt and simultaneous diversity. Pottery styles associated with the Great Lakes, with the southeastern coastal plain with the river systems draining the eastern plains, all appear together in the stratigraphic context of Cahokia's first decades. These are not styles that diffuse slowly village by village, across generations of gradual cultural exchange. They arrive in compressed layers, as though the people who made them arrived within a single generation, drawn to the same place by forces the ceramics themselves cannot name. Some researchers describe the early Cahokia population as genuinely cosmopolitan, a word that carries an almost uncomfortable weight when applied to a city in 11th century North America, and yet fits what the physical record preserves with a precision that more cautious language does not quite capture. What drew them is the question that none of the current evidence fully resolves. The agricultural advantage of the American bottom was real, but it had existed long before 1050 without producing this result. The geographic centrality of the floodplain was equally real and equally long-standing. Something additional occurred, some convergence of leadership ideology and circumstance that the record gestures toward without naming, and the archaeology can show us the gathering without being able with any confidence to show us the call. What it can show is the organization that followed the Grand Plaza. 40 acres of deliberately leveled ground, its surface built up from careful layered fills where the floodplain dipped, its drainage engineered with soil types chosen for specific hydraulic properties. This is not earth moved in haste. It is earth placed with sustained and disciplined attention across years of coordinated labor toward a vision of what the space should eventually become. That attention, its precision, its scale, and what it implies about the knowledge carried by the people who exercised it, is where the first trace begins. What the earth was asked to hold, the base of Monk's Mound covers 14 acres. That measurement appears in every serious treatment of Cahokia, and it is easy to read past without fully absorbing what it means in physical terms, not as a number on a page, but as a surface beneath your feet. 14 acres of ground, every cubic foot of it carried there by hand, basket by basket, hauled up increasingly steep inclines by people working in organized crews across what the stratigraphic record suggests were at least 14 distinct construction episodes spread over more than a century. The mound rises in 4 massive terraces to a height of 100 feet. From its summit on a clear morning, every settlement within the greater Cahokia complex would have been visible, the river beyond them catching light, the whole geography of the city laid out below in a pattern that was from that elevation clearly not accidental. Someone had designed the view as deliberately as they had designed the platform from which it was seen. The number that carries the most weight, though, is not the height or the footprint. It is the volume. Monk's Mound contains approximately 22 million cubic feet of compacted earth, and a figure that, when set beside the volume of the Great Pyramid of Giza, reveals that Cahokia's central monument exceeds the Egyptian structure in total material moved. The Great Pyramid is taller, yes, because the stone stacks more efficiently than soil, and because its builders had access to copper tools, draft animals, and mathematical traditions developed across many generations of monumental construction. The builders of Monk's Mound had digging sticks, woven baskets, and stone tools. They had no wheels, they had no animals trained to carry loads. They had, as far as the archaeological record indicates, only the organization of human labor and the accumulated empirical knowledge of how Earth behaves under compression moisture and the weight of additional earth placed on top of it. Knowledge that, when you examine what they actually built, turns out to have been sophisticated enough to produce a structure still standing substantially intact nearly 1,000 years after the last basket of soil was placed. That structural integrity is not accidental, and it is one of the details about Monk's Mound that rewards sustained attention. The builders did not simply pile earth into a cone and leave it to settle. Archaeological investigation of the mound's interior, conducted through carefully placed test trenches, and more recently through ground-penetrating survey, has revealed a deliberate internal architecture invisible from the surface. Clay layers were placed at specific intervals and angles to resist water infiltration, preventing the kind of internal saturation that causes earthen structures to slump or fail catastrophically after heavy rain. Sand lenses were introduced to manage drainage, directing water laterally out of the mound's body, rather than allowing it to accumulate at load-bearing points. Alternating loads of different soil types were placed in sequences that created internal stability through differential compaction, a technique that requires not only knowledge of how different soils behave, but the organizational capacity to source and transport multiple soil types to the same location and place them in the correct order. Whoever directed this construction understood, without the formal vocabulary of modern geotechnical engineering, the principles that modern geotechnical engineers would eventually name. There is also the matter of the wooden framework. Traces of horizontal log placements have been identified within the mound's structure. At key points, timbers laid not as floors or platforms, but as internal reinforcement functioning in a manner that the analogy of rebar in concrete, while imperfect, captures with reasonable accuracy. These were not visible features. They were buried deliberately within the earth, serving a structural purpose that only someone thinking about the long-term behavior of the material could have anticipated. A builder concerned only with the immediate appearance of the mound would have had no reason to place timbers where no one would ever see them. Their presence implies a kind of forward projection, an understanding that the structure being raised would continue to bear load across generations, and that its integrity across those generations had to be engineered into it from the beginning, not improvised after failure. The construction did not proceed continuously. The 14 distinct episodes visible in the stratigraphy represent separate mobilizations of labor, each one requiring the organization of work crews, the sourcing of materials, the feeding and coordination of people who are not during these episodes farming or producing the goods that sustain daily life in the city. This points towards something that archaeologists describe carefully, but that the evidence makes difficult to avoid: a system of surplus and obligation sophisticated enough to periodically redirect significant portions of the city's labor capacity toward construction projects with no immediate practical return. Monk's Mound did not produce food. It did not shelter families from weather. It produced something less tangible, and apparently more essential: a physical statement about the relationship between the city and the sky, between the people living at its base and whatever authority resided at its summit. The investment makes sense only if that statement was understood to be worth making and worth remaking across more than a century of intermittent effort. What stood on top is known only in outline. Post holes preserved in the summit platform indicate wooden structures with footprints suggesting buildings of substantial size, some potentially reaching 100 feet in length. These would have been visible from the farthest edges of the urban complex, catching morning light at an elevation that nothing else on the floodplain could match. The summit was almost certainly not a public space. The effort required to reach it and the controlled access, implied by the palisade surrounding the central precinct below, suggest that the platform and whatever it held were reserved for a narrow category of activity and person. The city was organized in part around the mound's existence. The mound was organized in part around its summit, and the summit in turn was organized around something the archaeology can locate physically but cannot at this distance fully name. What it can offer is this. The mound was not the only structure in Cahokia that encoded precise knowledge in its construction. Roughly a half-mile to the west, a very different kind of architecture was being raised and revised, built not to last, but to be accurate. The circle that kept being corrected. The post holes were found by accident, which is how a significant portion of what we know about Cahokia came to light, not through targeted excavation guided by prior knowledge, but through salvage archaeology conducted ahead of highway construction in the 1960s and 1970s, when the ground was opened not to answer questions but to make way for infrastructure, and the questions arrived uninvited from beneath the blade. What the excavations revealed in the area west of Monk's Mound was not a building, not a burial, not a midden. It was a pattern: dozens of deep, regularly spaced post holes cut into the subsoil in broad arcs. some of the holes large enough to have held upright timbers more than a foot in diameter arranged in circles that when mapped resolved into something the excavators had not been expecting to find on the American bottom in the 11th century. The circles were keyed to the sky, specifically to the sun and to the 4 moments in the solar year when its behaviour is most precisely predictable: the spring equinox, the summer solstice, the autumn equinox, and the winter solstice. From the central post of each circle, specific uprights on the perimeter aligned with the exact point on the local horizon where the sun rose on each of those days. The alignment just was not approximate. It was the kind of precision that requires sustained observation across multiple years, the careful recording of where light falls at specific moments, and the translation of that accumulated data into the placement of physical markers in the ground. Archaeologists identified at least 5 distinct versions of these circles built and dismantled and rebuilt across roughly 2 centuries of use. The largest, often designated Woodhenge 3, had a diameter of approximately 410 feet and contained 48 perimeter posts, plus the central marker, a circle large enough that an entire community could stand within it and watch the horizon together. The earlier versions were smaller, with fewer posts. The later ones added more, and in some cases shifted the positions of existing markers by amounts too small to be explained by imprecision in the original construction, and too consistent to be explained by timber decay and hasty replacement. These projects look to the researchers who have studied them most carefully like corrections, the kind of adjustments made when a measuring instrument is refined rather than merely maintained. Each iteration of the circle appears to have been slightly more accurate than the one it replaced, tracking additional celestial events or resolving ambiguities in the alignment that the previous version had left open. The word that keeps appearing in the literature is iteration, and it is the right word. This is not a sacred monument that was rebuilt when it decayed. It is a scientific instrument that was upgraded when a better version became possible. The practical dimension of this is worth holding alongside the ceremonial one because the two were not separate in Cahokian life. Maize agriculture at the latitude of the American bottom is genuinely sensitive to timing. The growing season is long enough to support a productive harvest, but not so long that errors in planting schedule can be easily recovered from. A community that plants too early risks frost damage to seedlings. A community that plants too late compresses the time available for the crop to mature before the first autumn frosts arrive. In a temperate climate where cloud cover can obscure the sky for weeks at a time, anchoring the agricultural calendar to fixed astronomical events, rather than to observe temperature or day, length provides a stability that experience-based methods alone cannot consistently deliver. The solstices and equinoxes happens on schedule regardless of what the weather is doing. A community that can identify them precisely and that has encoded that identification in a permanent physical structure has effectively solved a problem that variability in local conditions would otherwise make difficult to solve reliably year after year. But the circle was also theatre, and the theatre was inseparable from the authority it produced. On the mornings of the solstices and equinoxes, the sun rose in a specific notch between specific posts, and whoever stood at the centre of the circle, at the moment that alignment occurred, appeared to have anticipated it, appeared to know before it happened exactly where and when the sky would perform. For the people standing within or around the circle watching this unfold, that knowledge would not have read as technical competence. It would have read as access to something beyond ordinary human perception, to a relationship with celestial order that not everyone possessed. The person at the centre was not merely a timekeeper. The architecture of the circle made them in the eyes of everyone watching an intermediary between the human world and the movements that governed it. That is a form of authority that requires no army to enforce and no treasury to maintain. It sustains itself through the reliability of the sky. What the 5 iterations of Woodhenge suggest taken together is that this authority was not static. It was actively maintained and refined across generations, which means that the knowledge enabling it was not held by a single individual but transmitted, taught and improved upon over time. There were people in Cahokia whose primary occupation was watching the horizon at dawn, recording what they saw, and adjusting the circle when the record indicated adjustment was needed. The detail is not small. A city that invests 2 centuries in the continuous refinement of a solar observatory is a city organized around the idea that precision matters, that the relationship between human activity and celestial pattern is worth getting exactly right and worth correcting when it drifts. That same drive toward precision, toward alignment between what is built and what is true, extended as the record shows into territories considerably darker than sunrise ceremonies. The shape beneath the shell. 20,000 marine shell beads, each one drilled by hand threaded onto fibre, were arranged on the floor of a burial pit in a pattern that took the excavators some time to recognise because they were not expecting to see it. The beads had been placed not as a pile, not as scattered grave goods, but as a deliberate composition wing's extended tail, fanned head, turned at the angle a bird of prey holds when it surveys the ground from altitude. A man approximately 40 years old had been laid directly on top of this image, his body positioned so that the shell mosaic beneath him fused visually and apparently intentionally with his physical form. He was not buried with a falcon. He was buried as one. The distinction matters because it places him not in the category of a chief who favoured bird imagery, but in the category of a figure whose identity in death, if not in life, was understood to have merged with something that moved between the human world and whatever lay beyond it. Mound 72 sits southeast of Monk's Mound, a low ridge-top rise that decades of ploughing had reduced to something so unassuming that it attracted little attention before excavation began in the early 1970s. What the dig revealed was not a single burial event, but a layered mortuary complex built up across multiple episodes over 270 individuals in total interred across a sequence of pit constructions that appear to span a significant portion of Cahokia's formative period. Some of these burials are clearly elite. 2 men were laid head-to-head on a bed of high-status artifacts, their positioning deliberate and ceremonially precise. Others are harder to read without discomfort. One pit contained the remains of more than 50 young women, most estimated to have been in their late teens or early 20s, arranged in orderly rows at a depth and in a manner that does not suggest natural death followed by communal burial. Another nearby pit held a similar concentration of similarly aged individuals. Their skeletons showed no evidence of long-term illness, no healed injuries suggesting lives of sustained hardship, and in a number of cases signs consistent with simultaneous or near-simultaneous death, including indicators of strangulation and hemorrhage. A third mass interment held over 40 individuals whose skeletal positions suggested they had been deposited without the careful arrangement visible in the other pits, some showing evidence of having been bound at the time of death. The mainstream archaeological interpretation of these findings is human sacrifice, and it is stated with the caution that the physical evidence warrants, which is to say with acknowledgement that the bones preserve signs and not testimony, that the patterns are strongly suggestive rather than absolutely conclusive, and that the interpretive frameworks brought to the evidence shape what the evidence appears to say, but the caution does not dissolve the pattern. The concentration of young women, the simultaneous death indicators, the spatial relationship between mass interments and elite burials in the same mound, these are not features that the available alternative explanations handle comfortably. Epidemic disease does not produce simultaneous death among healthy young adults arranged in rows. Battlefield casualties do not typically arrive in a single pit adjacent to a carefully composed falcon burial. The evidence preserves the shape of a ritual program, even if the specific theology organizing that program is not recoverable at this distance. What Mound 72 complicates is the image of Cahokia, that the astronomy and the engineering might otherwise support a city of patient observers, of careful builders, of people who invested decades in refining the precision of a solar calendar because precision was understood to matter. That image is not false. The archaeology of Wood Engine Monk's Mound is real. But Mound 72 insists that the city which produced those structures also produced this one, and that the same authority which maintained the cedar circles and organised the basket hauling crews also maintained the capacity to determine that certain people would die as part of a burial program for certain other people. The city was not divided between its beautiful achievements and its violent ones. They were expressions of the same organising principle, a cosmology that understood the universe as requiring active maintenance, and that located the responsibility for that maintenance in a narrow class of figures whose connection to the celestial order had to be demonstrated periodically and dramatically in ways that the entire population could witness. The falcon imagery links Mound 72 to a visual tradition that appears in various forms at Mississippian sites across the eastern half of North America, a figure that researchers have called the Birdman, a warrior or hero with avian attributes who moves between the human world and the realm above it. Whether the man in the shell mosaic was understood as an embodiment of this figure, a ritual reenactment of a founding myth, or a ruler being elevated into divine status through the material of his burial, the interpretations available to us share a common feature. They all require a community willing to invest extraordinary resources, 20,000 drilled shell beads, the labour of multiple mass interments, the organisational capacity to stage all of it. As a coordinated event in the proposition that certain deaths and a certain kind of death were necessary to keep the world in order. That proposition did not exist in isolation. It was held alongside the astronomy and the engineering, and all three taken together begin to suggest something about how Cahokia understood itself, which is where the three traces placed beside each other for the first time start to resolve into a single and more complicated picture. Three things that face the same direction. If you were to place the three traces side by side, not as separate investigations into separate features of a single site, but as facets of a single coherent intention, what shape do they form together that none of them forms alone? The question is not rhetorical. It is the kind of question that the physical evidence considered in aggregate actually presses toward, and it deserves to be held without being rushed into an answer. Monk's mound encodes precision in its internal structure, clay layers placed to manage water infiltration, sand lenses calibrated for drainage, alternating sand, soil types chosen for their differential compaction properties, horizontal timbers buried where no one would ever see them because their function was structural rather than visible. The precision is not decorative. It is aimed at a specific outcome, a structure that would continue to bear load across generations, that would resist the processes that cause earthen monuments to fail, that would still be standing long after the people who built it had been replaced by people who had only inherited the obligation to maintain it. The builders were not thinking about the present. They were thinking about what the mound would need to be across time. Woodhenge encodes a different kind of precision aimed at a different kind of duration. The 5 successive iterations of the cedar circle represent not 5 separate decisions to build an observatory, but one sustained decision spanning 2 centuries to keep the observatory accurate. Each time the circle was rebuilt, it was rebuilt better. Its alignments refined its capacity to track the sun's annual passage, made more reliable. That knowledge required to do this was not held in a single mind or a single generation. It was transmitted, tested against the observable behaviour of the sky, and corrected when testing revealed discrepancy. The circle, like the mound, was a structure designed to function across time, not to celebrate a moment, but to maintain a relationship between human activity and celestial pattern that the community understood as requiring perpetual tending. Mound 72 encodes a third kind of precision, and it is the most disturbing of the 3 precisely because the care it represents was directed at something the other 2 structures were designed to sustain. The shell mosaic beneath the falcon burial required the drilling and threading of 20,000 individual beads, each one shaped to a consistent size, the whole composition arranged to a specific visual end. The mass interments adjacent to the elite burials were not disordered. The young women were arranged in rows. The pit constructions were spatially coordinated with the central burial in ways that suggest a program, a sequence, a choreography of events that unfolded according to prior design, rather than improvised grief. The precision of Mound 72 is the precision of ritual of people who understood exactly what they were doing, and why, and who understood it within a framework that made the doing not only permissible but necessary. What the 3 traces share placed side by side is that orientation toward necessity. The mound had to be built correctly because it would stand for generations, and its failure would be a failure of what it represented, not merely of what it was. The circle had to be kept accurate because the sun's behaviour was not a metaphor. It was the actual mechanism by which agricultural timing was maintained, and errors in that timing had consequences measured in harvests and hunger, and the rituals of Mound 72 had to be performed correctly because the cosmology organising Cahokian life understood certain deaths as genuinely required, for the continuation of cosmic order, not symbolically required, but actually required in the same register that planting required correct timing, and the mound required correct construction. The 3 structures are expressions of a single underlying proposition that the world is maintained through precision, and that the maintenance of precision is the central obligation of those who hold authority. This is not a proposition unique to Cahokia. Variations of it appear in early state-level societies across the world in the astronomical alignments encoded in Egyptian temple architecture, in the sacrificial calendars of Mesoamerican urban centers, in the ritual precision of early Mesopotamian kingship. What they share is the understanding that the gap between human activity and cosmic order is not self-closing. It requires active intervention performed correctly by people whose authority derives from their demonstrated capacity to perform it. The ruler who knows when the sun will rise, who builds the structure that will still stand when their grandchildren's grandchildren are old, who oversees the ceremonies that renew the relationship between the city and whatever governs its continuation, that ruler is not exercising power in the way that modern political frameworks define power. They are exercising a form of custodianship over the fabric of reality as their culture understood it, and the authority that comes with that custodianship is of a different order than the authority that comes from force or wealth alone. Cahokia, the convergence of the three traces suggests, was organized around this custodianship at every scale, from the drainage engineering buried inside a mound no one would ever excavate to the cedar posts adjusted by fractions of a degree to refine a solar alignment, to the careful arrangement of the dead in patterns that the living could read as confirmation that the order of things was being properly maintained. Not proof of any single theory about what Cahokia was or what its rulers claimed. A pattern coherent, persistent, and pointing in a direction that the skeptic's voice, which must be heard, will now have the space to examine. What the careful mind requires. The convergence described in the previous chapter is real in the sense that the physical evidence genuinely points in that direction. But pointing is not arriving, and the distance between a coherent pattern and a confirmed conclusion is exactly where the most important intellectual work happens. The case for Cahokia as a city organized around a unified cosmological program, precision engineering, astronomical tracking and ritual sacrifice as three expressions of a single underlying proposition is compelling in outline. It is also in several of its key elements more ambiguous than a cleaner narrative prefers to acknowledge. The ambiguity does not dissolve the pattern, but it does change the confidence with which any particular interpretation of that pattern can be held, and the change is worth making the explicit before the pattern is allowed to calcify into something it has not yet earned the right to be. The first area of genuine uncertainty concerns scale. The population estimates for Cahokia at its peak range, depending on the researcher, and the methodology from approximately 10,000 in the urban core to figures approaching 50,000 when outlying communities are included in the count. That range is not a minor disagreement about rounding. It is a disagreement about what Cahokia actually was, whether it was a dense urban centre comparable in population to the major cities of medieval Europe, or whether it was a more loosely organised regional hub, whose apparent scale partly reflects the tendency to attribute to a single political entity what may have been a constellation of related but semi-autonomous communities. The ceramic evidence for immigration is real, but ceramic style is a notoriously imprecise proxy for political affiliation or physical residence. People adopt pottery traditions for reasons that have nothing to do with migration through trade, through intermarriage, through the prestige that attaches to goods associated with a powerful centre. The presence of Great Lakes ceramic styles at Cahokia does not by itself prove that people from the Great Lakes lived there. It proves that the objects or the ideas travelled. The people may or may not have followed. This matters for the convergence argument, because the cosmological unity attributed to Cahokia, the proposition that mound engineering, solar astronomy, and sacrificial ritual were expressions of a single coherent worldview, enforced by a centralized authority, depends on there having been a centralized authority to enforce it. A city of 10,000 organized under a paramount chief, whose legitimacy rested on a demonstrated celestial knowledge and controlled access to exotic materials, is a different kind of political entity than a loose regional network of communities that shared symbols and building styles without sharing governance. The former makes the convergence argument easy. The latter makes it considerably more complicated. Some researchers argue that the Mississippian world, including Cahokia, is better understood as a network of influence and emulation than as a hierarchy of command that the platform mounds and solar alignments spread across the eastern half of North America. Not because Cahokia exported them through political authority, but because communities across the region found them useful and adopted them on their own terms. That argument deserves weight, It does not dissolve the observation that someone at Cahokia built Monk's Mound and Woodhenge with sustained precision across multiple generations, but it does complicate the claim that the precision was centrally directed. The second area of uncertainty concerns Mound 72 specifically and the interpretation of its mass interments as evidence of ritual sacrifice. The physical evidence, young women arranged in rows, simultaneous death indicators, spatial coordination with elite burials is genuinely difficult to explain through the available alternatives, but it is not impossible to explain them, and the distance between difficult and impossible is where responsible interpretation must remain. Epidemic disease, for instance, would not typically produce the arrangement patterns visible into the Mound 72 pits, but epidemic disease followed by deliberate communal burial of the dead, arranged with care, placed near the remains of a prominent individual as an act of association rather than sacrifice, is a scenario that the skeletal evidence cannot definitively rule out. The death indicators interpreted as signs of strangulation or hemorrhage are at the level of bone preservation available from an 11th century burial open to alternative readings. Bone does not preserve the distinction between a killing and a death from other causes with the reliability that a forensic examination of fresh remains would provide. The pattern in Mound 72 is strongly suggestive of a ritual program involving violent death. It is not at the level of physical evidence currently available a closed case. What the skeptical reading of Mound 72 does not easily account for is the consistency of the demographic profile across multiple separate interment events. If the mass burials reflect epidemic mortality, or battlefield casualties, or some other category of death, not organized by a ritual intent, the concentration of young women within a specific age range, repeated across distinct pit constructions that appear to span different episodes, becomes difficult to explain as coincidence. Epidemics and battles do not preferentially kill healthy women between the ages of 15 and 25 across multiple separate events at the same location over an extended period. The demographic consistency is the detail that the alternative explanations handle least convincingly, and it is precisely the kind of detail that a careful skeptic must acknowledge rather than pass over. The third area of uncertainty is perhaps the most fundamental because it concerns not a specific finding but the interpretive framework applied to all of them. The convergence argument that Monk's Mound Woodhenge and Mound 72 are three expressions of a single cosmological proposition about the maintenance of cosmic order as a framework imported from comparative anthropology and applied to Cahokia because it fits the visible pattern. But fitting a pattern is not the same as being demonstrated by it. Early state-level societies across the world show versions of the same combination: monumental construction, astronomical precision, and sacrificial ritual organized around centralized authority. The recurrence of the combination is real. Whether it reflects a universal dynamic of early state formation, or whether it reflects the tendency of researchers trained in that comparative literature to find the pattern they are looking for, is a question the evidence at Cahokia alone cannot answer. The framework is useful. It is also at the boundaries of what the physical record can support a framework rather than a finding. What remains after the skeptical reading is not nothing. The mound was built with engineering knowledge that the casual observer would not anticipate from a pre-contact North American society. The cedar circles were rebuilt and refined across 2 centuries in a manner consistent with systematic astronomical observation. The demographic profile of the Mound 72 interments is not well explained by the alternatives available. The pattern formed by these 3 observations placed beside the skeptical qualifications that each of them requires is not confirmed and not dismissed. It is genuinely unresolved, which is not a failure of the investigation, but an accurate description of where the investigation currently stands. That unresolved quality is itself a form of evidence, though not the kind that points toward a conclusion. It points toward a question that the city, its builders, and the 1,000 years separating us from both have conspired to leave open. The weight of what travelled. In a storage room at the Illinois State Archaeological Survey, there are fragments of copper that were excavated from the elite burial context at Cahokia over the course of decades of systematic excavation. They are thin-hammered to flat, some of them cut into the shapes that suggest deliberate design, headdress guards, components, ornamental plates, objects whose specific function is not always recoverable but whose material is. The copper is not local. There is no copper ore within any reasonable distance of the American bottom. Chemical and isotopic analysis of samples from Cahokian contexts traces the metal back to the Lake Superior Basin, to surface deposits and shallow mines worked by indigenous communities in what is now northern Michigan and Wisconsin, a distance of roughly 500 miles from the floodplain where the finished objects were buried. That distance was covered without wheeled vehicles, without draft animals, without roads in any sense that the word currently implies. It was covered by canoe by foot by the accumulated effort of trade relationships maintained across generations, each exchange adding value and distance until the raw material arrived at a centre, capable of working it into the forms that the burial record preserves. The copper is one thread in a material web that, when mapped in full, reveals something about Cahokia that the skeptical reading of the previous chapter did not diminish. Whatever the precise population of the city at its height, whether 10,000 or 30,000, whether tightly governed or loosely affiliated, it functioned as a node of sufficient gravitational force to pull materials from across half a continent into its burial pits, its ritual deposits and its craft workshops. Marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic seaboard arrived in quantities sufficient to produce the 20,000 beads beneath the Falcon burial, and to supply workshop districts where artisans drilled and shaped them into finished goods across years of specialized labor. Churton flint with geological signatures traceable to quarries in Oklahoma, Arkansas, and the eastern Appalachians accumulated in the napping districts of the city. Mica, the glittering flaky mineral found in Mississippian ceremonial contexts, arrived from the southern Appalachian highlands more than 500 miles to the southeast in quantities that suggest it was not a rare curiosity, but a material with a consistent ceremonial demand that the trade network was organized to meet. What the skeptical reading correctly established is that the presence of these materials does not prove a single centralized political authority directing their movement. Trade networks can sustain themselves through distributed relationships, through chains of exchange in which no single node controls the entire flow, and in which materials travel vast distances without ever passing through a single administrative center. That is an accurate description of how many pre-state trade systems operate. What it does not account for is the concentration. The quantities of copper shell and exotic stone that accumulate at Cahokia during its peak centuries are not evenly distributed across the network. They pool at the center specifically in the elite burial and ritual contexts that the archaeological record identifies as the locus of whatever authority the city exercised. Materials that are rare everywhere else are common. Here in these specific deposits, in these specific associations with the figures whose burials were organized with the greatest ceremonial investment. The distribution is not the distribution of a decentralized network in which all nodes receive roughly proportional shares. It is the distribution of a system in which one location was understood by everyone participating in the network as the appropriate destination for the most valued materials. The isotope evidence adds a dimension that the material distribution alone cannot provide. Analysis of strontium and oxygen ratios in the teeth of individuals buried at Cahokia, ratios that reflect the chemical signature of the water and food consumed during childhood, and that therefore preserve a record of where a person grew up, has identified a meaningful proportion of individuals whose childhood signatures do not match the American bottom. Some of these people grew up hundreds of miles from the city that became their burial place. They are not all elite. Some appear in common burial contexts, their grave goods modest, their skeletal stress markers consistent with the hard physical labor that the construction and maintenance of the city required. They came to Cahokia, in other words, not only as pilgrims or traders or diplomatic visitors, but as residents, people who had relocated from distant home communities to live and work and eventually die in a city that the chemical record of their own bones identifies as not the place where they began. This is the detail that the skeptical reading of population estimates does not fully address. The uncertainty about whether Cahokia held 10,000 or 50,000 people at its peak is real and should be maintained, but the isotope evidence for long-distance migration into the city is not a population estimate. It is a direct physical record preserved in individual human teeth of the fact that people travelled from far outside the floodplain and made Cahokia their home. The city was not only a place where exotic materials accumulated, it was a place where people accumulated, people who had decided or been persuaded or been compelled by circumstances now unrecoverable, that the centre of the Mississippian world was where they needed to be. What drew them is a question the isotopes cannot answer. That they came is a question the isotopes have already settled. The trade network and the migration evidence together suggest a Cahokia that was, whatever its precise political structure, genuinely central to a continent-scale world, in a way that goes beyond symbolic influence or shared aesthetic. Communities from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico were not simply admiring Cahokia from a distance and painting their pottery in styles they associated with its prestige. They were sending their materials there, and in some cases sending their people. The city exerted a pull that the archaeology measures in copper and shell and the chemical signatures of teeth, and that pull was real enough to reorganize at least partially, and for at least 2 centuries, the movement of both goods and human lives across half a continent. What that pull was composed of, whether it derived primarily from agricultural surplus, from religious authority, from military capacity, from the control of trade routes, or from some combination of these forces that the available evidence cannot yet disaggregate, is a question the record holds without resolving. But the pattern that the skeptical chapter asked us to hold with appropriate uncertainty does not, in the light of the material evidence, fade into indistinction. It sharpens in certain respects into something the trade network and the isotope data make harder to dismiss than the convergence of 3 structural traces alone would have permitted. The city pulled things toward it, and the things it pulled, the copper, the shell, the distant-born residents whose teeth carry the chemical memory of other rivers and other soils, tell us that whatever Cahokia was, it was known. Across distances that modern intuition still struggles to hold, it was known. And being known at that scale in a world organized around the movement of canoes and the slow transmission of knowledge through kinship and ceremony required something more than a large mound and a well-calibrated circle of cedar posts. It required a reputation, and reputations, unlike mounds, are built from what people tell each other in the dark. The world that organized itself. Around the center. A chunky stone is a modest object, typically a few inches across a mound, smooth from a fine-grained stone, sometimes grooved around its circumference to help a player's fingers find their grip before releasing it across a cleared field. It fits in one hand, weighs perhaps half a pound, and carries in its plainness none of the ceremonial weight that the copper plates and shell mosaics of Cahokia's elite burials so visibly project. And yet chunky stones travel farther in the archaeological record than almost any other object associated with the Mississippian world. They appear at sites across the eastern half of North America, from Wisconsin to Georgia, from the Appalachian foothills to the edge of the Great Plains, in contexts that span several centuries and dozens of distinct cultural traditions. A copper plate stays in the burial pit of the person important enough to own it. A chunky stone ends up everywhere, which means it was wanted everywhere, which means the game it served and the world that game implied carried a kind of appeal that prestige objects alone could not generate. The game itself, as far as the ethnographic and archaeological record allows, reconstruction involved rolling the stone across a prepared surface and hurling spears or javelins to land as close as possible to where it stopped. The skill required that was real reading. The stone's trajectory accounting for the field's surface, releasing the javelin at the correct moment, and the competition it produced was public and apparently intense. Later accounts from southeastern nations describe chunky games drawing crowds of hundreds, with political leaders watching from elevated positions and spectators staking significant wagers on outcomes. The game created an occasion, a reason for people to gather, a framework for competition that did not escalate to violence, a space where alliances could be affirmed and disputes could be negotiated through the medium of athletic contest. Where chunky stones travel, the social logic of the Mississippian world travels with them the understanding that certain kinds of public competition conducted in a certain kind of public space were how communities related to one another, at the boundary between cooperation and rivalry. This matters for understanding how Cahokia's influence extended across a continent without leaving the kind of documentary evidence that would make the mechanism of extension legible to later observers. The city did not need to send armies to every community that eventually raised a platform mound and began playing chunky in a cleared plaza. It needed only to be known as the place where these things originated, or were most fully realized, or were practiced at the greatest scale, and the knowledge of that association traveling through the same trade networks that carried copper and shell would have been sufficient to make adoption appealing to communities seeking legitimacy within the broader Mississippian world. To build a platform mound, to establish a central plaza, to organize public chunky games, these were not merely practical choices. They were statements of affiliation signals that a community understood itself as participating in a particular kind of civilization and aspired to be recognized as doing so credibly. The northern boundary of that aspiration is marked most clearly by Aztalan, a fortified community in what is now southern Wisconsin situated along the Crawfish River at a latitude considerably beyond the comfortable northern range of intensive maize agriculture. Aztalan's platform mounds its central plaza. Its surrounding palisade and its material culture all show strong Cahokian affinities close enough that the debate among researchers is not about whether the connection exists, but about what kind of connection it was. Was Aztalan a community that voluntarily adopted Mississippian organizational forms because doing so conferred advantages in the regional trade network? Or was it something more directly planted? An outpost established by people from the Cahokia heartland, staffed at least partially by migrants functioning as a northern node in a system whose center remained on the American bottom. The evidence supports the connection clearly. It does not, with the resolution currently available, settle the question of what the connection meant in political terms. Further up the Mississippi in western Wisconsin, a cluster of platform mounds at a site known as Trempealo occupies a bluff overlooking the river, at a point that would have been visible to any canoe traffic moving north or south along the main channel. The mounds are small, the occupation appears to have been relatively brief, but the ceramic assemblage and the construction techniques match early Cahokian patterns closely enough that researchers have described Trempealo as perhaps the most direct physical expression of Cahokian presence at a significant distance from the city itself, a way station, a seasonal ritual camp, a trading post, or some combination of functions that the archaeological record preserves in outline without filling in the operational details. What is clear is that someone brought Cahokia to that bluff in the form of specific building knowledge and specific pottery traditions at a time when the city on the American bottom was still in its formative period. The reach of the network was already long before the city reached its peak. To the south and southeast, the Mississippian world that Cahokia anchored during the 11th and 12th centuries continued to unfold across the following 2 centuries in a constellation of regional centers that carried the organizational template forward into new landscapes and new political configurations. Moundville in present-day Alabama arranged its platform mounds in a ring around a central plaza in a pattern that echoes Cahokia's Grand Plaza precinct at a compressed scale. Ottawa in Georgia produced carved stone and shell artwork dense with the same iconographic vocabulary: falcon warriors, forked eye symbols, cosmic axes, dividing sky and earth that the Cahokia region's earliest elite burials established as the visual language of Mississippian authority. At Spiro in eastern Oklahoma, a single mound yielded a concentration of copper plates, engraved shell gorgets, and wooden sculptures, representing the most elaborate surviving expression of southeastern ceremonial complex imagery anywhere in North America, the objects having accumulated there through trade and tribute relationships that extended across the entire Mississippian world. None of these centers are Cahokia. Each has its own history, its own sequence of construction and decline, its own regional relationships and political logic. But the shared vocabulary, the mounds, the plazas, the chunky stones, the falcon imagery, the solar alignments encoded in building orientations is too consistent across too great a distance and too many independent communities to be explained as parallel invention. Something organized this world, or at minimum something drew it into coherence, and the archaeology of the 11th and 12th centuries consistently points toward the American bottom as the place where that coherence was most fully realized before it dispersed into the regional variations that followed. What the dispersal also carried, though it travelled more slowly and left less visible traces in the ground, was the memory of what the centre had been and the knowledge of what had caused it to stop being that. The things that happen without a name. The memory of what the centre had been was still forming when the centre began by degrees so gradual that no single generation would have experienced them as a turning point to come apart. This is the part of the Cahokia story that the physical record preserves most densely and explains least satisfyingly. Not because the evidence is thin, but because the evidence is abundant in a way that resists reduction to a single cause, and the temptation to impose one anyway is exactly the temptation that the record examined carefully does not reward. What the archaeology offers instead is a sequence of conditions, each one documented with reasonable precision, none of them sufficient alone to account for what followed, all of them present simultaneously in the period between roughly 1150 and 1350 CE, accumulating against a city that had, over the preceding century, organised itself in the ways that made it unusually vulnerable to the specific kinds of stress they collectively produced. The sediment cores are the first register. Taken from lakes and backwater deposits surrounding the Cahokia complex, they preserve a stratified record of what was happening to the land surface during and after the city's peak centuries. The layers corresponding to Cahokia's height show elevated concentrations of charcoal and disturbed mineral sediment, and the signature of intensive land clearance, sustained agricultural use, and the erosion that follows when forest cover is removed and rain falls on bare or overworked soil, without the root systems that would otherwise hold it in place. Pollen profiles from the same cores show a progressive reduction in tree species and an expansion of open ground indicators across the period of the city's growth. The forests near the American bottom were thinned, then pushed back in some areas effectively eliminated within the radius that the city's fuel construction and agricultural land requirements demanded. This was not damage in the sense of an event. It was the cumulative consequence of sustained occupation at a scale the local landscape had never been asked to support, expressed slowly in the chemistry of lake sediment across a period of generations. Then in the layers corresponding to approximately 1200 CE, the cores record something more abrupt. A flood event of sufficient magnitude to deposit a distinct sediment horizon across low-lying areas of the floodplain areas that had been during the preceding decades under cultivation or residential use. The timing coincides with what the archaeological record of the site itself suggests was the beginning of a demographic shift construction. Episodes becoming less frequent in the core precinct, refused deposits thinning in districts that had previously been densely occupied, evidence of new household establishment declining relative to the earlier phases. The flood alone does not explain the shift. Cahokia had been built on a floodplain and had survived seasonal inundation across its entire history. But a flood arriving against a landscape already stripped of the forest cover that would have slowed runoff, already pushing its agricultural fields into marginal areas that offered less resilience against disturbance, already sustaining a population whose size left little buffer between adequate harvest and genuine shortage. That flood lands differently than the same flood would have landed a century earlier, when the land and the city still had room to absorb it. The tree ring records from the broader Midwest introduced the next layer. Dendrochronological sequences from the region show a pattern of increasing climatic instability across the 13th and 14th centuries. Not a simple deterioration toward cold or dry, but a series of oscillations between wet and dry conditions with drought, intervals of sufficient duration and severity to have materially affected maize yields across multiple consecutive growing seasons. Maize is in good years the most productive crop available to a community at this latitude. In bad years in drought, years in late frost years, in years when the growing season is compressed at both ends by climatic instability, it is among the most punishing, because the communities that have organised themselves around its surplus have done so at the cost of the agricultural diversity that would otherwise provide a buffer against its failures. The late woodland communities that preceded Cahokia grew goosey, foot, marsh elder sunflower, and squash alongside maize, maintaining a portfolio of food sources whose risks did not all peak in the same conditions. Cahokia at its height had shifted that portfolio decisively toward maize. The efficiency that made the city possible became in the conditions of the 13th century a structural liability. The bones carry the next record, and it is the most intimate. Children's teeth from the later phases of occupation at Cahokia preserve enamel hypoplasias at rates that researchers describe as elevated relative to the earlier periods to horizontal lines and pits in the enamel surface that form when nutritional stress or serious illness interrupts the normal process of tooth development during childhood, leaving a permanent record of the disruption in the tooth structure. These are not rare findings in pre-industrial populations. They become diagnostic when their frequency increases across a population over time, which is what the Cahokia skeletal record appears to show in its later phases. Adult skeletons from the same period carry higher rates of arthritis and repetitive stress injury, the cumulative signature of sustained heavy labour. Skeletal markers consistent with chronic infection and respiratory disease appear more frequently, and the trauma-evident skull fractures, embedded projectile points, cut marks on bone surfaces consistent with interpersonal violence increases in frequency in the assemblages associated with the city's declining centuries in a pattern that does not reflect a single catastrophic event, but a sustained elevation in the background rate of violent injury across the population. The palisade was rebuilt at least 4 times. Each reconstruction required the felling, hauling, and setting of thousands of logs, consuming labour that could not simultaneously be directed at food production or construction elsewhere in the city. You do not rebuild a fortification of that scale and complexity 4 times unless the perception of threat from external rivals, from internal instability, from some combination of forces that the palisade was intended to address, recurs across the span of generations rather than resolving after a single defensive episode. The wall's repeated reconstruction is not by itself evidence of what the threat was. It is evidence that whatever the threat was, it did not go away. None of these conditions assembled in sequence resolves into an explanation. They assemble instead into a pressure, steady, cumulative operating simultaneously across the environmental, nutritional, and social registers of a city that had been organized in every dimension of its physical existence for expansion rather than contraction. What happens to a city built for expansion when expansion is no longer possible is a question the record poses without answering. The answer, when it came, arrived not as an event, but as a direction, and the direction was away, from a sufficient distance. What does a city look like when you are far enough away from it that its individual features stop demanding separate attention, and the whole becomes visible at once? The question has a literal answer in the case of Cahokia, and the literal answer arrived unexpectedly from the air. When researchers flew LiDAR survey equipment over the American bottom. In recent years, an airborne laser system capable of penetrating tree canopy and detecting subtle variations in ground surface elevation with centimetre-level precision. The map they produced bore only partial resemblance to the map that a century of ground-level excavation had generated. The core precinct was where it had always been Monk's Mound, the Grand Plaza. The Woodhenge Post circles the ridge of Mound 72 to the southeast. But the boundaries that previous mapping had drawn around the city turned out to be artifacts of the limits of ground-level vision rather than features of the city itself. Beyond those boundaries, the LiDAR data revealed a landscape still carrying the faint but unmistakable impressions of neighbourhoods, causeways, borrow pits, and mound platforms that ploughing and construction had reduced to surface variations too subtle for the unassisted eye to read as architecture. Greater Cahokia, the survey suggested, was not a city surrounded by dispersed satellite communities. It was a single urban complex of a scale that the ground-level record had consistently underestimated its edges, blurring into the floodplain gradually, rather than stopping at a wall or a ditch. This is what sufficient distance reveals, not the details that close examination produces, but the shape that the details taken together actually occupy. And the shape of Cahokia, seen from the aerial perspective that LiDAR makes available across a millennium of surface disturbance, is the shape of a sustained human intention. Not uniform, not rigidly planned in the manner of a Roman garrison town laid out on a grid before the first tent was pitched, but organised around a centre, with a consistency that the dispersal of its elements across 6 or more square miles does not obscure. The mounds align. The plazas face each other across distances that no single ground-level observer could have measured directly. The neighbourhoods cluster around local centres that mirror at smaller scale the relationship between the Grand Plaza and Monk's Mound. The pattern recurs at multiple scales simultaneously, the way a landscape shaped by a single underlying geological process expresses the same logic in the form of its hills and its stream channels and its soil horizons, each at a different magnitude, but all legible as expressions of the same force. From this distance, the 4 traces that the preceding chapters followed separately begin to read as aspects of a single orientation rather than as independent phenomena requiring independent explanation. The engineering precision of Monk's Mound, the astronomical precision of Woodhenge, the ritual precision of Mound 72, and the continental reach of the trade network and migration patterns. These are not 4 separate facts about a city that happen to be located in the same place. They are 4 expressions of a city that understood itself as a centre, in a sense that was simultaneously geographic, cosmological, and political, and that organized every dimension of its physical existence around the maintenance of that centrality. The mound announced the center vertically, the plaza confirmed it horizontally, the cedar circles calibrated it celestially. The copper and shell flowing in from 500 miles in every direction expressed it materially, and the people who arrived with the chemical signatures of distant rivers still legible in their teeth expressed it humanly through the decision, or the necessity, or the aspiration to be where the center was. What the distance also reveals, and what the ground level traces can suggest, but not quite demonstrate, is the temporal depth of that organization. Cahokia was not built in a season or a decade. The 14 construction phases of Monk's Mound, the 5 successive iterations of Woodhenge, the multiple episodes of palisade reconstruction, the layered mortuary sequence of Mound 72, all of these extend across a period of roughly 2 centuries during which the city was continuously remade rather than simply maintained. Each generation that inherited Cahokia also modified it, adding to the mound, refining the circle, rebuilding the wall, adjusting the ceremonial program in ways that the stratigraphy records as distinct episodes rather than as continuous accumulation. The city was across those 2 centuries, always in the process of becoming more fully itself, always being corrected toward an ideal of precision and alignment that the previous generation's version had approached but not quite achieved. This is not the behaviour of a population passively inhabiting an inherited urban form. It is the behaviour of a population actively engaged in the proposition that the city was worth improving, that the relationship between its physical form and whatever that form was meant to embody could always be brought into closer alignment. That proposition is what the decline dismantled, and the dismantling is also visible from the distance that the synthesis requires. The sediment cores and tree ring records and skeletal stress markers are not from this elevation. A list of causes leading to a single effect. They are the record of a city whose organisational logic, the concentration of labour, surplus and authority at a centre that promised cosmic maintenance in exchange for human investment, became progressively less sustainable as the environmental and demographic conditions supporting it shifted in directions that the logic had not been designed to accommodate. A city organised for the perpetual maintenance of order encounters disorder, and the tools it has developed for maintaining order are not the tools needed for adapting to its absence. The palisade rebuilt 4 times is not a city solving its problem. It is a city applying its habitual response, more construction, more precision, more demonstrated authority to a situation that the habitual response was no longer adequate to address. The people who left did not leave a failed city. They left a city whose organisational proposition had exhausted the conditions that made it convincing, and they carried the elements of that proposition with them into the dispersal, the mound building knowledge, the solar alignment practices, the iconographic vocabulary of Falcon and cosmic axis, which is why those elements appear reconfigured and scaled to new circumstances at Moundville and Etowah and Spiro, and the dozens of smaller regional centres that constituted the Mississippian world after Cahokia's centre ceased to hold. The city dissolved into its own influence, and the influence outlasted the dissolution by centuries. From sufficient distance that looks less like collapse and more like transformation, a reorganisation of the same underlying intention across a wider and more distributed landscape, the centre having served its purpose and released what it had gathered back into the world it had for 2 centuries organised around itself. What that world became and what was done to the memory of what it had been is the last layer the record asks us to hold, what forgetting requires. There is a particular quality of light in the American bottom, in the hour before dawn, flat directionless, arriving before the sun has cleared the bluffs to the east and before the sky has decided what colour it intends to be. In that light the mounds lose their edges. Monk's Mound becomes a mass rather than a structure, its 4 terraces, smoothed by the low angle of the pre-dawn glow, into something that looks at a glance almost natural a hill, that the land might have produced on its own, if the land here produced hills, which it does not. The illusion lasts only a few minutes. Then the light sharpens, the geometry returns, and the thing reveals itself again as what it is, a human decision executed at enormous scale that has outlasted by 1,000 years the civilization that made it. The mound was built to be seen. For most of the time since its builders dispersed, it was seen without being understood. looked at, wondered over, and then systematically explained away. The explaining away is its own archaeology, and it has its own stratigraphy. The first layer was innocent in the way that ignorance is innocent before it becomes convenient. Early European travellers in the Mississippi Valley encountered the mounds and asked the communities living near them what they were. The answers they received were complicated stories of ancestors of powerful figures who had lived in an earlier time of a world organised differently than the world the travellers were moving through. These answers were not wrong. They were the oral records of a real history compressed and transformed by the same processes that transform all transmitted knowledge across generations of disruption and relocation. But the travellers were not equipped to hear them as history. They heard them as mythology, and the distinction they drew between history and mythology was itself a cultural artifact, a product of a tradition that located legitimate knowledge in written documents and regarded unwritten transmission as inherently unreliable, regardless of what it preserved. The second layer was less innocent. By the early 19th century, as the United States was expanding westward and the political and legal machinery of indigenous dispossession was being constructed and operated at scale, the mounds presented a problem that the expanding nation needed to resolve. They were too large to ignore and too obviously constructed to be attributed to natural processes. If they had been built by the ancestors of the nations currently living in the Mississippi Valley and the surrounding regions, then those nations had a relationship to this landscape, a historical, architectural and arguably legal relationship that the ideology of westward expansion required them not to have. The solution was to invent a different builder. The lost race theories that proliferated across the early 19th century Israelites, Egyptians, Welsh, explorers, refugees from Atlantis, were not primarily archaeological hypotheses. They were political instruments, and they'd functioned with considerable efficiency for several decades, providing the intellectual scaffolding for a dispossession that was already underway by the time the theories were being published in pamphlets and delivered in public lectures. Cyrus Thomas dismantled the lost race argument in 1894 with a systematic rigour that the argument had never itself possessed a continent-wide survey, careful excavation artefact comparison, and there's a straightforward conclusion that the mounds were built by the ancestors of the indigenous peoples of North America and by no one else. The conclusion was correct, and it changed the direction of serious archaeology permanently. What it did not change with anything approaching equivalent speed was the broader cultural narrative within which the mounds were understood by the population that had accepted the lost race theories as historical common sense for the better part of a century. The professional consensus shifted, the popular imagination moved more slowly, and the political structures that had been built on the earlier narrative did not dismantle themselves in response to a Smithsonian report. What the forgetting ultimately required, what it requires of any successful erasure of a history inconvenient to a prevailing story, was not active conspiracy so much as sustained inattention. The mounds did not need to be actively suppressed after the lost race argument collapsed. They needed only to be omitted from school curricula, organised around a narrative that began with European contact from the architectural and landscape heritage frameworks that directed preservation funding toward colonial-era structures from the popular historical imagination that had never been given a framework within which Cahokia could be understood as something other than an anomaly. Omission is a more durable instrument than suppression because it requires no maintenance. A suppressed fact tends to resurface. An omitted one simply does not enter the conversation in the first place, and its absence eventually becomes invisible, indistinguishable from the absence of anything worth including. The nations whose ancestors built Cahokia did not forget. The Osage, the Quapaw, the Omaha, the Ponca, the Peoria communities whose linguistic and oral historical connections to the Mississippian heartland are traceable through both comparative linguistics and the content of their own transmitted narratives, carried memories of a great city beside a great river across centuries of displacement epidemics, forced relocations, and the systematic disruption of the transmission mechanisms through which such memories travel. The memories survived in altered forms as all transmitted knowledge survives alteration across sufficient time and disruption, but they survived. And when indigenous scholars and community members began returning to Cahokia in recent decades, not as visitors to an archaeological site, but as people encountering something that belongs in a deep and specific sense to their own history. What they found in the layout of the mounds, the alignment of the plazas, and the cosmological logic encoded in the site's physical organization was not foreign. It was legible. Not in every detail, not without the distortions that time and disruption introduce, but recognizably continuous, with a world their own traditions had been describing all along. We will not resolve this tonight. Not the question of what drew tens of thousands of people to the Merachkan bottom in the span of a single generation. Not the question of what the cedar circles were ultimately for. Not the question of whether the deaths recorded in Mound 72 were understood by those who organized them as necessity or as cost or as both simultaneously. These questions are not unanswerable in principle. They are unanswered now with the evidence currently available and the interpretive frameworks currently in use, and holding that unansweredness with honesty is the closest the record permits us to come to the truth of the matter. The archaeology preserves the shape of what happened. It does not preserve the experience of living inside it. The specific weight of obligation, the specific texture of belief, the specific quality of the authority that could convince a population to carry 22 million cubic feet of earth to a height of 100 feet over the course of a century, and then go on maintaining and refining and inhabiting the result for another century after that. What it does preserve in the sediment cores and the shell mosaics and the corrected angles of the cedar circles is evidence of a civilization that took seriously in every dimension of its physical existence. The proposition that the relationship between human life and the order of things required tending, that the world did not maintain itself, that someone had to hold the alignment. Whether that proposition was correct is a question the mounds cannot answer. That it organized for 2 centuries one of the largest cities in the medieval world, a city most of the people who live near its ruins have never heard of, is a question the ground already has. The summit. Before light. The winter solstice sunrise at Cahokia arrives at an angle that from the summit of Monk's Mound clears the eastern bluffs and strikes the ground of the Grand Plaza at a low trajectory, raking light the kind that makes every surface relief visible, every slope and depression in the levelled earth suddenly legible as the engineered feature it is, rather than the natural ground it mimics. From 100 feet above the floodplain at that angle of light on that specific morning, the geometry of the city would have been completely apparent to anyone standing on the summit platform. The plaza stretching south, the ring of platform mounds at its edges catching the same low light from the same direction near simultaneously, the post circles of Woodhenge to the west. If the posts were still standing, their shadows thrown long and precise across the prepared surface of the circle's interior, the central post's shadow pointing exactly where the alignment specified, it should point at this moment on this morning and no other. The river beyond the tree line catching light in fragments through the bare winter canopy. The outlying communities still dark, their cook fires has not yet lit the smoke, not yet rising. The city below and around and extending to the horizon in every direction that the floodplain permitted, organised around the point where you were standing in a way that was most fully visible at precisely this moment on the shortest day of the year, from this height in this light. Someone stood here on winter solstice mornings. The archaeology does not record their name, their lineage, or the specific content of whatever ceremony the summit platform hosted at this hour. It records the post holes of the buildings that stood here, the compacted surface of the platform itself, the careful engineering of the drainage systems buried inside the mound to ensure that the platform would remain stable across the seasons and the centuries. It records the fact that the summit was accessible only through a climb that no one could make casually, and that the palisade below controlled who could approach the mound's base in the first place. The archaeology records, in other words, that whoever stood here did so within a system of access and exclusion that had been built quite deliberately to make this vantage point rare. The view from the summit was not a public amenity. It was a position one that had to be earned, inherited, or seized, and that carried with it the obligation to perform at moments like this one, the knowledge that the position required. What that knowledge felt like from the inside is the one thing the record cannot offer. We can reconstruct the alignment, we can measure the angle of winter solstice light at this latitude, and confirm that from this elevation at this position, the sunrise would have appeared in a specific notch of the eastern horizon, corresponding to the Woodhenge alignment visible to the west. We can infer from the scale of the city organised around this point and the 2 centuries of sustained labour invested in maintaining and refining the structures encoding that organisation, that the knowledge performed here was understood to matter, understood by the people watching from below and by the person standing above as something more than spectacle. not proof. A pattern held in earth and cedar and the chemical signatures of bones pointing toward a civilization that organized itself around the proposition that certain people standing in certain places at certain moments, determined by the movement of the sky, were doing something necessary. Something the world as they understood the world required. The mound is still there. This is the fact that, held quietly at the end of everything the preceding chapters have traced, carries the most weight. Not because it is surprising, but because it is so easy to pass over without fully absorbing what it means. Monk's Mound has been standing for approximately 9 centuries since the last construction episode added its final layer of earth to the summit platform. It has been rained on, flooded around, ploughed at its edges, built over at its base, and surveyed, excavated and debated across the full span of modern American archaeology. It has outlasted the civilization that built it by a factor of roughly 4, has outlasted the lost race theories invented to explain it, has outlasted the St. Louis earthworks that were demolished for brick factories in the 19th century, has outlasted the academic careers of every researcher who has studied it. It has not outlasted the people whose ancestors built it, because those people are still here. The Osage in Oklahoma, the Quapaw, the Omaha, the Peoria, the communities whose oral traditions carry memories of a great river city into the present tense rather than the past. The mound outlasted the city, the people outlasted the forgetting. What remains on the summit now is grass and a maintenance road, and interpretive signage explaining in the measured language of public archaeology what the structure beneath the grass is and approximately when it was built and by whom. The signage is accurate. It is also in the way that accurate summaries of 9 centuries of human intention inevitably are incomplete, not because it omits facts, but because facts do not capture the full weight of what it means to stand on 14 acres of deliberately placed earth and look out across a floodplain that a civilization once organized around the point where you are standing. The weight is not in the information. It is in the ground under your feet and in the angle of the light and in the distance between what was here and what replaced it, and in the further distance between what replaced it and what has been allowed slowly and only recently to return to view. The post holes of Woodhenge are dark circles in the subsoil, visible only in the walls of an excavation trench, their cedar posts long since decayed into the earth that held them. The shell beads of Mound 72 are in storage, catalogued, conserved inaccessible to the casual visitor. The copper from the Great Lakes is in museum drawers. Its esotopic signature recorded its journey from the northern mines to the burial pit of a falcon-shaped man documented in analytical reports that most people will never read. The city that all of these objects and post holes and soil layers once constituted is grass and maintenance roads and the faint LiDAR impressions of neighbourhoods that subdivision development has not yet entirely erased. And on the winter solstice the sun still rises at the angle the cedar circles were built to mark. The alignment holds. The sky performs on schedule. The mound receives the light exactly as it was positioned to receive it 900 years after the last person who understood what that positioning meant climbed to the summit to watch. Rest now. Traveller, 22 million cubic feet of earth placed by hand, basket by basket, across more than a century of sustained intention. That was where we began tonight, with a number easy to pass over and harder to put down once held. The mound is still there. The light still arrives at the angle the builders understood. The geometry of the Grand Plaza still holds its shape beneath the grass, legible to instruments that were not available a generation ago, patient in the way that only things made from the earth itself can be patient, returning slowly on their own schedule to the attention of a world that spent several centuries choosing not to look. We followed 4 traces through that return: the sudden gathering of a city from scattered villages, the cedar circles rebuilt and refined across 200 years of careful celestial attention, the shell mosaic beneath a man laid out as a bird of prey and what the layers beneath him cost, and the long quiet work of forgetting the specific mechanisms by which a civilization of this scale was permitted to become in the story a nation told about itself, an absence rather than a presence. None of these traces resolved into a conclusion tonight. They were not meant to. They were meant to be followed far enough that the shape they form together becomes visible and then held, not solved, just held in the particular quality of attention that the space before sleep makes available. There is something the mind does in this hour that the waking mind resists. It allows incompleteness. It permits a question to simply be a question without requiring the machinery of resolution to begin immediately turning. History at the distance from which we encounter most of it is always incomplete, not because the past was simpler than we imagine, but because what survives into the present is a fraction of what existed, filtered through the accidents of preservation and the choices of those who decided what was worth keeping. What we have of Cahokia is a fraction of a fraction the parts of the city that soil and time preserved, the parts of that preservation that excavation has reached. The parts of that excavation that the interpretive frameworks available to any given generation of researchers were equipped to recognize as meaningful. The rest is in the ground still, or was ploughed under or burned or dissolved in the chemistry of centuries. What remains is enough to know that something extraordinary organized itself on the American bottom for roughly 200 years. It is not quite enough to know with the confidence the full story would require what that something understood itself to be. That gap is not a failure of the investigation. It is the honest condition of any inquiry conducted across 1,000 years of distance, and sitting quietly inside it, neither collapsing it prematurely into a conclusion nor expanding it into a void, is perhaps the most accurate response the evidence permits. One thing the ground offers soft and unhurried somewhere in the nations that carry Mississippian memory forward into the present. Someone tonight may be holding the same question from the inside that we have been holding from the outside. What it meant to build something at large, what it cost, what it was for, whether the alignment maintained with such precision across so many generations of effort was ever felt as worth the maintaining, or whether that question itself is one that the cosmology organizing Cahokia would not have recognized as sensible. Some propositions are not questions from inside them. Only distance makes them questions, and we are very far away. Let the distance be comfortable now, Let the mound stand in the dark at the edge of thought, grassed over, quietly geometric, receiving whatever light is available in whatever season the night outside your window belongs to. Let the cedar posts of Woodhenge Gorge dissolve back into the soil that held them, their alignments preserved in the subsoil as dark circles that no one is measuring tonight. Let the falcon rest in his shell mosaic wings, extended patient as the earth he was given back to. The floodplain is quiet at this hour. The river moves south without consulting anyone. The stars that the Cahokian timekeepers watched, the same stars in the same positions, tracking the same annual passage, are still doing what they were doing when the cedar circles were new. They do not require our attention to continue. They will be there when you wake. The mounds will be there. The questions will be there unchanged and unhurried, asking nothing of you tonight. Sleep now, traveller, the ground remembers, you don't have to.